Louisiana state history. And we got to thinking about what a cool topic. We didn't know if people would be interested, but look at the crowd they are. Alligator farming in South Louisiana. And we have one of my dear friends here to speak. He's had 5 generations of family members actually harvest alligators through time. More in the more recent decades, formally with Sagrera Gator Farms and other entities related to that. He'll tell you all about it. By the way, here's a little trivia. He happens to be a great country singer and strums a good guitar, which I promised him I wouldn't tell you, but I just did. So the secret is out. Without further ado, give a big round of applause for our friend and your friend, Alligator Farmer, Stephen Sagrera.
Thank you all so much. Eric, thanks for the kind words. He mentioned that I goof off as a singer sometime, and we recently shut the band down because we couldn't get people to come see us. If I could get this crowd at Kelvin's Bar on Saturday night, I'd probably still be singing. No, thanks again for everyone for coming out. Can y'all hear me okay? So, when Eric asked me about 3 months ago to do this presentation, I really struggled, for 3 months. Not on the content, but trying to figure out how I could keep this interesting enough that nobody walked out, but boring enough that I don't have to give this presentation anywhere but tonight. So let's see how this works out. So yeah, I want to start with kind of the early years of alligator harvest in the state of Louisiana. So throughout the 1800s, alligators were used for their fat or for their oil, used in steam engines and in cotton gins, I guess for lubrication. Not really sure, but I know that was the main demand through the first part of the 1800s until the Civil War broke out, and then demand increased more, and skins were actually used for boots and saddles for the Confederate soldiers. So more demand, more unregulated harvest. By 1900, folks figured out how to tan the skins and create a soft leather, similar to what you see here. It's very soft, very durable, and the luxury market noticed that. And 1900s, early 1900s, people wanted handbags, mainly overseas, but they wanted handbags, they wanted luxury items. So again, you increase the demand for the Louisiana alligator. So let's start at 1900. That's about the time, and Mike Sagrera's here, he can probably back me up, that my family moved down here and settled on the coast. So my great-grandfather, Mr. Sam Sagrera, this photo's taken in the 1920s. So they settled on Chenier-Tig, and they farmed cotton, they had cattle, they trapped, they hunted alligators, sold alligator skins. They did whatever they could do to scratch out a living out there for years. And so this photo is a photo of him in the 1920s. You can see the alligator thrashing around at the bottom, using a method called pole hunting. And I'm going to dig a little deeper into that in a second. But that's a photo of him catching an alligator with a wooden pole. Here's another photo from the same hunt. And while we're on this, I'm going to fast forward to 1985. Mr. Sims' son, Anthony, or Tanny as we called him, got a permit to recreate pole hunting after it was outlawed. And so I've got a couple pictures to show you here. So what they're doing, you can kind of see just a hole in the marsh. And what these old timers would do is they were in the marsh year round. So they knew where all alligator holes were. And you just go to the hole, stick the pole in there, feel around. The alligator's defenseless. You drag them out, hit him in the head with a hatchet, skin him right there, and tote the skin out the marsh. So that was the practice. That was the main method of taking alligators, probably through to 1962 when the season was closed. I'll take a little bit of time here to mention the folks, because these are four folks who aren't with us anymore, but that I really looked up to growing up. So that's Anthony Sagrera with the cowboy hat. He's the one demonstrating the pull technique. It's my father to the top left, Wayne. That's Mr. Pete Leger in the middle, and Mr. Alton Schode on the right. And same thing here, just a little bit better photo of, you can see them reaching into the hole and hooking the alligator. And there you go. That's about a 7-footer that they pulled out of the hole. Oh, and by the way, I need to mention this. The gentleman to the far right is Madam Mayor's father, Kenwood. Another one of my childhood heroes. And I get to enjoy breakfast with him a couple days a week, so he's still around. So while we're on this photo, I'll talk a little bit about pole hunting. Pole hunting was outlawed when they reopened the season in 1972. It was outlawed because it was just so easy to harvest an alligator with a pole. And unintentionally, they were targeting mostly females, because in the marsh where these holes are on the edge of your ponds or in little ditches or what have you, that's where your females live. Your males are typically in the deeper water, in the canal banks. So what was happening through all this unregulated harvest is they were wiping out the population of females. So I'll get to it a little further in presentation, talk about when they reopened the season, but no more pole hunting. It was just too indiscriminate. So let's see where we're at here. So in 1962, Louisiana voluntarily closed the alligator trapping season. They knew that the population was in trouble, and they closed the season in 1962, 5 years before the alligator was listed on the endangered species list in 1967. So Louisiana was pretty proactive when picking up that there was a problem and trying to do something about it. When research began in the 1950s, we didn't really knew nothing about alligators, and so one of the first things I think that was discovered was that the population, they estimated the population to be somewhere between 100 and 150,000 statewide alligators. And in let's call it 1960, right around that time. So they shut the season down and began doing research. Here's these two guys right here. To your right is Mr. Ted Joannan. Left is Mr. Larry McNeese. This photo is taken at Rockefeller Refuge. All of this alligator research took place at Rockefeller. These two guys were in my mind, they were responsible with getting the ball rolling with the whole alligator program. I think it was their idea. Farming was their idea, basically. I'll get into that a little bit more. But without these two guys, the rest of the presentation doesn't exist. They're really responsible for.
They were biologists, right?
They were biologists at Rockefeller, yes. We happen to have another gentleman in the back who was at Rockefeller, served some time there, Mr. Mark Shirley, worked with these two gentlemen. So thank you, Mark, for. Yes, it was. Yes, it was. So a couple more things about wild harvest and then we'll move on. They shut the season down from 1962, reopened, did an experimental season in Cameron and Vermilion Parish in 1972. So they gave about 10 years for the population to try to rebound. And by about 1980, I guess, the harvest was opened back up statewide, but highly regulated with strict quotas and no pole hunting. So I've got a couple photos. This is at Rockefeller Refuge. I believe these tanks actually survived the hurricanes, but I don't think that building there did. That's where they did all the research. Those tanks are where they would house they did the incubating of eggs that they collected and housed, grew the animals out that they were studying. So some of their findings I'd like to talk about, that stick out in my mind, was that you could successfully incubate the eggs. You could take the eggs from a wild nest, bring them in, successfully incubate them, and the animals would thrive with virtually no mortality in a captive in these tanks. And they figured out what was the optimum temperature to keep that animal alive and healthy and growing, what the best food was, at the time. But most importantly, here's the thing this theme that's going to kind of go through the rest of my talk. As I recall, what they found out is that for the eggs that are laid in a given year, alligators lay once a year, the eggs that are laid in a given year, there's a 95% mortality rate for the next 5 years. So 5% of the eggs that are laid in 2023 will still be here 5 years from now. Whether the nest gets flooded before it hatched, there's things, if they do hatch, predators get them. Alligators are highly cannibalistic. So those first few years, those 2, 3 foot, 4 foot animals are targets for the larger animals. So you have, what they learned is basically 95% of this natural resource is lost. And it's highly sought after resource. I mean, the luxury industry wants alligator skin. It's the best in the world. The American alligator is the best in the world. There's one other croc skin that comes close, but alligator is really what these folks want. So they come up with an idea of how can we take advantage of this 95% and possibly create an industry, and at the same time have a conservation aspect to it, replenish the wild population. So they came up with the idea of we got to bluff a few folks in the private sector to take a flyer and build buildings and try to see if they can raise these things. So they started recruiting in the late 70s, looking for folks who would take a flyer, become an alligator farmer. And what they would do is if you got a license, they would go out on Rockefeller Refuge, collect the eggs, incubate, hatch, and they would supply you with up to 1,000, 500 to 1,000 baby hatchlings to get your farm started. With one requirement, you had to, out of those first hatchlings you got, you had to select a certain amount to grow out and create a breeding stock. You had to have your own breeders. They wanted, that was their idea that 10, 15 years from now, we're not going to be supplying you any more hatchlings. You're going to be self-sufficient. You have your own breeding pens. You get your eggs from there. So at that same time, late 70s, this is another picture of I've got the wrong, I pulled some pictures out and evidently we're on the wrong PowerPoint here. But that's another picture of Mr. Larry McNeese, one of the lead folks over at Rockefeller. We'll get back on track here. Okay. Can anybody tell me what these two alligators have in common?
They're the same color.
That's very good. Anything else? I didn't expect that answer, but that's accurate.
She said they were the same color.
Okay. So, any guesses? Okay, we have a hand up here.
They're both prey?
Good try. That's good.
They're both.
She said they're both prey.
They both raised in your farm, in a farm?
No.
They're both the same age?
They're both the same age. Very good. So what Rockefeller learned, I did not think anybody was going to get that. Good job. So they're the same age. I'm not exactly sure when this picture's taken, but based on my experience, this is probably an early summer of that given year. This was taken at Rockefeller. And the larger animal is 10 months old, as is the smaller. But the little guy, he was in the wild. He hatched in the wild, stayed in the wild, went through the winter. The big guy hatched 1st of September and was put in that optimal condition, fed, kept warm. And so right there, that photo right there was like, wow, maybe we can do this. And so they used this photo along with other tactics, I guess, to convince folks, to try to get a handful, 3 or 4 guys to give this thing a try. So while they were doing this, going through this recruiting process, one of their main targets was my father. And starting in about 1978. And I'm a little disappointed in my slideshow here because I may have to jump around a little. Y'all excuse me.
That's okay, we'll be patient.
Okay. I don't know, so I don't give presentations and I don't know how computers work. So I know I had these in order. I changed it today and evidently I opened the wrong file when I got here. So we'll get to the photos I want to show later. So my grandfather and my father were alligator dealers, fur buyers, alligator dealers. So the folks at Rockefeller knew that we had access and relationships overseas and in New York with the folks who wanted to buy these skins. So they targeted Wayne. You need to do this, Wayne. You need to do it. And he's like, no. He resisted. Another reason that they targeted him is one of the things we did along with buying fur is my grandfather would buy nutria carcasses from all the trappers, Vermilion Parish. And he was grinding the nutria meat and shipping it to mink ranches in Wisconsin. Up to like 1.5 million pounds a year. So one of the things that research showed, at that time you had 2 choices to feed. At Rockefeller, they were feeding their alligators, was nutria or fish. And there was no comparison. I promise you, that's a nutria-fed gator. That was not a fish-fed gator. So they just knew that Wayne was probably, my dad was a perfect fit. And he resisted, like I said, for about 4 years. In 1982, he farmed rice. Rice crop was terrible. Cattle prices were down. He was a fur buyer. That was the beginning of the end of the fur industry. In the early 80s, fur was taboo. You had a lot of anti-use people in all the cities, throwing paint on people that wear fur coats and what have you. That was all going on at the time. So that part of the business was kind of depressed. Crawfish farmer, today, even, crawfish is tough. So I guess he figured, you know what, maybe I need to look into this and give it a try. And he finally agreed to it in 1983. So in 1983, he agrees to it. He builds one building, and I'm going to mention some other folks here that are really partly responsible for me being here today. In 1983, when he agreed to build his building, well, he was going to have to wait till September of 83 to get his hatchlings from Rockefeller. And I can only imagine that through my father's friendship with Leger family, which I'll mention a few names. Some of you know who I'm talking about, some won't, but Pete Leger, Burton Leger, Lonnie Leger, those guys took care of all of the McElhenney property and Rainy Wildlife, which is owned by National Audubon Society. They were the land managers. And one of the very high up folks in Audubon, Mr. Frosty Anderson, loved Rainy Wildlife, was his favorite Audubon sanctuary. So he was down here all the time. And I can only imagine, over quite a few cocktails, they come up with a scheme, and how they talked the state of Louisiana and Rockefeller Refuge into this, I don't know. But Rockefeller went at night in airboats with headlights and caught 235 3-foot wild gators. Brought them to Wayne, to my dad, to give him a head start. They've never done that since, before or since. So that's a kind of cool story, and I wanted to mention the Legers and Mr. Frosty Anderson because it's really true. You know, we had such a close relationship with those folks, and that's how we started. Was, you know, had we not known them, we may not have had that avenue to kind of get that ball rolling. Got a couple of Legers in the back, by the way. So it started with 235 that year, and we're going to discuss this a little bit more later, but we actually peaked out at over 90,000 a year in 2008 and 2019, and we'll discuss that a little further in the future. So in 1985, up till 1985, you probably had about 10 farmers in the state at that time. Everybody's getting their hatchlings from Rockefeller Refuge. Well, I guess over some more cocktails, the idea is, well, why don't we collect eggs on Rainy Wildlife? Novel idea. Somehow Rockefeller bought into it, and my dad had the first permit to go and actually collect eggs from wild nest in 1985 off of Rainy Wildlife. Then by 1987, that spread to McElhenney property, of which Mr. Pete Leger was collecting eggs. Vermilion Parish School Board. I just got out of college, so my first eggs for my farm came from Vermilion Parish School Board. 500 eggs from those guys. And then in 1987, it spread to Vermilion Corporation, and it spread to Cameron, then, you know, statewide by 1988, 89. So by 1990, everybody wanted to be an alligator farmer. I mean, it was novel. We were making money the first few years. Everybody wanted to. So by 1990, we had 7 licensed farms in Vermilion Parish. We had the Sagrera family, Raywood's Deli, which if anybody who's ever been to Pecan Island knows where Raywood's place is. If the wind's out the southeast, you can smell it. I'm picking at Raywood a little bit. He's a great farmer, still in operation, and a good friend of mine. Mr. Pete Leger, Corey and Chad's father. Burnell Koch had a farm in Pecan Island. Floyd Lemaire, this is really briefly. Floyd Lemaire built a farm in a subdivision in Nunez. Not a lot of regulation back then. I mean, didn't matter. So, Bojo, somebody knows it. Yeah, okay, here we go. Murray, Gary, and Leonard Maillard had a little farm just south of Abbeville. And Rodney Sagrera, my dad's younger brother, and his father-in-law had a farm in Mouton Cove. Those kind of small couple buildings. So Vermilion Parish had it going on. So I'm gonna, with this wild egg harvest that you had now, part of that deal was you had to return 17% of what you hatched. When they got 4 foot long, had to go back to the wild. So that was the deal. We're gonna go out, we'll harvest them out the wild. You gotta replenish. We got to build that population back up. So this photo right here, I feel highly confident. This was in my parents' yard. I feel highly confident this is the first group of alligators returned from any farm in the state of Louisiana. This photo right here. He had the first contract on Rainy Wildlife in 1985. This photo was taken in 1987, so I'm pretty confident. And that's my dad there holding the bag. Mr. David Richard from Rockefeller. What he's doing there is they measure the animal, they check the sex, and at that point, all they were doing, they would put a notch in the tail. Excuse me, so that if it was ever seen in the wild or captured during wild harvest, they knew that it was a farm gator. So that's kind of a cool picture. I don't remember who. Chad, your mom might have given me that picture. I don't remember who gave it to me, but I didn't know it existed, and that's a pretty cool photo.
I have a question.
Yes.
Was there a requirement for what percentage of gender to be released?
No, they never really had an actual requirement, but if it got way out of whack, there wasn't like a set number. But you couldn't give all females or all males. But that's never really been an issue. It's always been, to be honest with you, probably we've been returning about 70% females to 30% males. That brings up another subject that I wasn't going to go to, and the reason is most farms, so temperature in the nest determines the sex of the alligator from day 7 to day 21. So as farmers, we try to shoot for a little bit cooler temperature, a little bit more females are less aggressive. So at the end of 2 years, the animals we have on the farm, they're more females when we go to do release. I think that's the main reason why historically there's always been more females that go out. Oh, excuse me. How about, let's do this. Let me take a couple questions while I open a different file, because this has got me really messed up. Do we have any questions?
I do.
Yes.
Explain why, when you pick the egg up from the wild, it has to be in a particular position.
Okay.
Are you gonna get to that later?
I was going to do that later.
Okay, never mind.
I apologize, y'all. Nah. Okay. Okay, so here's how we're going to do this. No, that's not what I want. So, no, we're going to get through this. I told you guys just enough screw ups that I don't have to do this again, right?
I think he's doing a great job, don't you?
So if you guys don't mind, I'm gonna run back and forth through a bunch of slides to get to where I want to be.
That's fine.
All right. Don't know how to work. Yeah, I have opened the wrong. Okay, so let's go back. I really don't know how this happened, but I can make this work. That's what you get, Eric.
Doing great.
I had a really great photo presentation put together.
We just saw.
Okay.
Really good.
If I recall correctly, I don't have the slide, but there's been roughly 700,000, between 700 and 800,000 animals released into the wild since we started the program. I had a graph to show you guys that, but can't find it. So.
Steve,
Yes.
could you tell what the cost of the eggs, I know that with the Vermilion Parish School Board, how much you pay per egg?
I paid $3 an egg in 1987.
And now?
This past year was 12. It's been as high as 30.
Wow.
Can we get one more question right here?
Yes.
study to see that the release gators are close or much lower, a much higher rate of reproduction than a gator that's not been released? I mean, do they breed and reproduce? Do
Yeah.
we know about that?
They do. They certainly do. In fact, if I had the right, Eric, would you come help me? I really need to apologize. So what,
This isn't a cost you statement.
Charlene, what did you ask me earlier?
That's okay.
I may have to get finish this thing. X out of this. Flash drive, it'll be the right one.
You can get to it later.
No, I need to do it now. I gotta kill some time.
The alligator eggs, you showed us that they
Okay.
You showed us that they grab the eggs out of the nest, but there's more to it.
Okay. I will get to that later. I forgot your question. Ma'am?
When y'all shut down for the 10 years, how low had the population?
The population was estimated between 100 and 150,000 in 1962 when they shut the season down.
And what was the height of it? Like, you know?
I have a cool slide that if we can find, that's going to answer your question. Yes.
This is gonna cost you a cold beer and a ribeye.
I'm losing it. He told me he'd buy me a steak dinner if I did this. I think I'm hamburger steak. That looks right.
Teamwork makes the dream work, right? Everything. Good? Okay.
Yay.
Yeah, I don't know. Okay, yes, it is. All right, so we'll back up a little bit. So when I mentioned earlier that my father was a target because they thought he'd be a good fit, I wanted to show a couple photos of him and my grandfather. They were fur and alligator dealers, and I went through that over that already, but that's a picture of my grandfather Ralph Sagrera, my dad rocking the comb over in about 1980. Grading some Nutri-Skins. Another picture of my grandfather Ralph during alligator season. Him and my dad, there were years, this is not in my notes, but just thought of this, there were years where we bought from trappers and sold to brokers or tanneries over 10,000 wild skins in a year. So they were kind of a big deal back then. Okay, yeah, this is just a more recent photo of the release crew, what they do now. You know, they're measuring, they're recording the sex, they're putting a unique tag in each of the back feet. They're still doing the tail notch, they're checking them for overall health. And if this animal is ever captured in the future, they can tell you what farm, what year, you know, when it was released, what farm it came from, you know, how well it grew, what have you. This is an alligator, one of our guys releasing in Vermilion Parish. Okay, this is an alligator that was released on May 11th, 2007, at 56 inches long, and you can see he was caught September of 21, so 14 years later, and it grew almost 6 feet. So they have a really good, you know, to get to Bo's question, they have a really good survival rate. I mean, this is only one example, but they do track it. They do well, they survive well. We see them at nest when we go out to collect eggs. They're thriving. And if you notice, if you look at the fins, they're called scoots, but those fins on the top of his tail, you see the notch? They're still doing that today. So if you're ever in the wild, or you have one in your pond, or an alligator that you see, if you can see its tail, if it has a notch, it's a farm release. If it doesn't, it was hatched in the wild. So just keep that in mind.
Steven, tell them why you shouldn't mess with that one.
Well, okay, so so we fed, these guys have been fed for 2 years on farms. Were there really a problem? Well, they can be, they're not afraid of humans, so they can be a little bit more, I wouldn't call it aggressive, but they're just not fearful. So they're, you know, they're a little bit harder to scare off maybe. Where they are a bit of a problem though, funny enough, is on the nest. If you get to a nest and it's a farm notched female, she's probably gonna put up a fight. Much more of a fight than a natural wild female will. Most wild females, you probably have to shoot her from the nest or kind of use a pole and keep her away. Maybe 1 out of every 10 nests. It's not like what you think it would be. Half the nest you go to, you won't even see the female. So, but the farm females, they will put up a fight. Okay, I was wrong. 1.2 million alligators released to the wild since 1988. So I'll talk about this a little bit later, but you know, I think we're overachieving a little bit, you know, as a department, and they'll tell you the same thing. When I get to somebody asked me about today's population or how did it peak. When you hear that number, it's pretty evident that, well, we kind of overachieved. We have to start cut things back the other direction. Okay, I mentioned earlier that in the very beginning, you were required to, out of those hatchlings that Rockefeller would give you, you had to keep your own breeder stock. This is a photo of the breeders in the late 80s at Rockefeller Refuge. I'll speak for Vermilion. We had a pen with 200 of these, about that size. Those are about 8 foot long. And you see the ones that are still coming to eat. They're just like that notched gator I just told you about. They are not scared. We had a John Deere gator, if anybody knows what a John Deere gator is, with a little bed in the back. We have our buckets of nutrient meat, and you'd go in the pen to feed. They climb in the back of the bike. They bite the tires. So you know it was a nightmare. And then if they did nest, those females really were aggressive. So what we learned about this captive breeding program is a couple things. It's extremely dangerous, and alligators are actually communal animals. They don't mind all being piled up like that, but I think when it comes time to reproducing, they like to pull the curtains down. You know, as Mr. Adcock said, they like to get a room. They don't nest, and they don't reproduce well in captivity. So not only was it dangerous, the folks at Rockefeller realized it's really not economically feasible, and especially with all the eggs in the wild, and that wild harvest was taking off. So that requirement was lifted. No longer, there might be a couple farms that have a few breeders, but you know everything is wild harvest eggs now. Any other questions right now? Okay. So this next photo is probably one of the first nests that my dad hatched at Vermilion. This is probably around early 90s, because in those early years I mentioned that we were collecting eggs off of McElhenney and off of Audubon. Well, Rockefeller they'd come pick them for us. They weren't going to let us out there to do it. You know, there was oversight. So they would collect them. They'd actually bring the eggs back to Rockefeller. They would hatch them and bring us the hatchlings. It was sometime in the early 90s when the program just exploded. They couldn't collect all the eggs for all these farmers. So the farmers had to start renting helicopters to spot the nest, buy airboats, go out and do it yourself. So this is probably sometime in the early 90s, probably one of the first nests that my dad had hatched. I thought this was kind of a cool photo. I wish it showed his face a little better, but this is actually Mr. Pete Leger with a bag of alligator hatchlings from Rockefeller. I think this is like his first ever alligators that he put on his farm. This photo right here. So I just thought it was kind of cool to include that. So they put 25 hatchlings in a sack and let them ride from Rockefeller to Mouton Cove. They're pretty hardy. It didn't seem to bother them. A couple examples. I've got a few pictures of some of the early barns that were built. These were built back in the 80s. And I've got a couple photos I wasn't really going to include, but it's kind of significant. So Rockefeller learned how to hatch the animals and the conditions you needed to keep them alive, to make them grow really well in a captive setting. So they had requirements. You needed to have so many square feet, you needed 4 inches of water, you needed 1/3 water, 1/3 dry, basking area. So I'll show you some examples of that. That's just kind of the inside of what a building in 1988 would look like. That's some roughly 1-year-olds. You can see they're only in about 4 inches of water, and that's significant. Another picture here of some that are a little over a year old. Same thing. You probably got about 3 inches of water in the front, maybe 6 in the back. And if you notice, they're kind of piled up in the corner. Now, baby alligators, that's a defense mechanism. They do that in the wild. I mean, they're not, I would say they're not stressed, but it's kind of like this room. If everybody piled together, you'd be all right for a little while. But, you know, after a few minutes, it's time to make a little elbow room, exactly. So we're following guidelines, but these animals, the skin quality was really terrible because they would bite each other, if you left them piled up in these corners too long. So, private enterprise, right? We're smart. This photo, we transitioned to, well, let's build round buildings like out of the same material they do grain silos, right? Rice bins. No corners. So everybody had these. We had 20 of these. No corners. We had 6 inches of water. We didn't improve things. Didn't get any better. It got a little better, but it's still a lot of scoring. Okay. I wasn't going to include this little graph because I thought it looked kind of cheesy, but the more I looked at it, there's a lot of stories to tell in that graph right there. So let's forget about the blue line, the blue part, and just concentrate on the red. So let's look from 86 up to a peak of 1990. Almost 300,000 had eggs collected across the state. But then look the dip to 94. What happened? So we went from not producing any skins to producing 300,000. There was a market, but there wasn't that big a market. And so in 1990, you couldn't sell them. And the ones you could sell, they'd go through them and only pick the ones that didn't have the scars and the bites. So a lot of folks went out of business. A lot of small farms, they built 2 or 3 buildings according to the state's specifications, thinking they were doing, the right thing. They couldn't sell their animals. So there's only a select few across the state who were able to absorb that, build new barns, figure out what we were doing wrong, and were able to survive. So from 90 to 94, there was kind of, purge is not the right word, but a lot of folks unfortunately went out of business. And then things picked back up. If you look, can't really tell here, but from 95 to about 2000, you see the kind of the up and down. That's strictly weather related. In a wet year, you have more eggs than a dry year. So, market was pretty steady all the way to about 2000, and it spiked. It got really, really good in 2000. And you see it peak, and I think that's 2004. I really can't see this angle. I'll say this, if you're in the alligator business, don't ever sign a contract for record high prices for your skins, because it's a kiss of death. So what happened in 2005 was Hurricane Rita. So Hurricane Rita affected Vermilion and Cameron. Didn't really affect the rest of the state. So, but that's what that dip in egg collection by roughly 200,000. is there were basically no eggs in 2006. Rita hit in the fall of 2005. We had an extremely dry winter. We're inundated with salt water. Extremely dry winter, dry spring, dry summer. No eggs. I'll give you an example. Vermilion Corporation was permitted for 55,000 eggs that year. We found 1,100. We found Audubon Society, 10,000 permitted. I think it was like 124. So there's just no eggs out there. So Vermilion and Cameron took a big hit, and that's why you see that drop there. So I'm gonna jump forward.
What happened in 2009?
Yeah, that big.
The big,
We're gonna. You fuss at me if I'm taking too long, Eric, but we're gonna get there. Good question. So I want to talk a little bit about Rita. This is actually for Hurricane Ike, and this is a really special photo for me. But for those of you who knew Mike Datraw, Mike Datraw took this photo for us, flying over our farm for Hurricane Ike out of his crop duster. And this was a couple days after the storm, so the water had gone down some, but there was, it's pretty significant. And this picture actually is still sitting on my dad's desk today. There's something about it. Mike's no longer with us, but that's one of my favorite photos. Okay, briefly. Eric said I had a pointer here, so let's see if it works. This photo is of a barn that was built just before 2005 and went through Hurricane Rita. When we got to this flooded, when we got out there the next day in airboats, the water level was about right here. But the debris was up here. So we figured out the water line was right at the top of the door. For about 30 buildings that we had over there, about 25,000 alligators. So this particular barn had 2,000 1-month-old alligators, and doors blew open and they escaped. The rest of our barns, one other barn with 1,000 escaped. The rest of our barns, the doors didn't open. But can you imagine, all those alligators just floated up, I guess, and they didn't drown. And it took about 14 days for that water to come down, and they just, they stayed in there. We spent the next 2 weeks going with tractors and hay wagons, waders, evacuating the farm. So, quick story about the ones that escaped. What do? They're this long, they're swimming everywhere. We go to Academy, buy minnow nets. Sorry, minnow nets. So we chasing them down we spent about 3 days chasing them down. And they're still right there by the building because they hatched. They went in that building. That's home to them. They don't know to go anywhere else. And when they're little like that, they call each other and they pile up. So when they hear each other, they just stay there. We caught 2,000 of the 3,000 that we were able to save. The last 1,000 got smart, and we finally had to give up. But I had roughly 20,000 hatchlings there that I sold to a farmer friend of mine at my cost. And I had just signed that record deal for my crop the next year. And so my buddy, who did me a favor buying these from me, he sold them at record prices we did. Back to our graph. Okay, we recovered the next year. We went from zero nest back to almost a record year. Blew my mind. I figured that it was going to take several years to recover. It recovered the next year. We had a lot of rain, a lot of fresh water. 2008, record numbers on the farm. That's one of those years I was telling you that we were up to 90,000. We signed another record-breaking contract. And the fall of 2008, there may be some bankers in here or some financial folks who remember. You had the financial crisis, the mortgage crisis or whatever that happened, right? So the world kind of goes into panic. We can't sell anything. This was worse than 1991. She couldn't sell anything. So you can see the next year there was about 30,000 eggs collected, and this was a volunteer deal where all the farmers got together and said, guys, we're not picking eggs this year. And so, tell you a quick Vermilion Gator Farm story. That year, we at the time we were exporting both our own skins and brokering for other farms. We were the leaders in the United States. About 150,000 skins a year. We had nowhere to go with them. So that gentleman that Mr. C.H. Cove from Singapore, at the time he owned a tannery in Singapore that we dealt with. He came down here, sat in our office, myself, my brothers, my dad, Pete Leger, all the little local farmers that we brokered for, and said, how are we going to get out of this? Bottom line is, we sent roughly $12 million worth of alligator skins to Singapore to keep in his cooler, and said, pay us when you can. On a handshake.
How did it work out?
So it took us 3 years and we collected. So another thing I want to mention, if you look at this graph, you're not going to ever find me at a craps table or at a casino. I do all my gambling right here. So we recover from that, and everything's moving along. You see that next dip, that's probably weather related. What happened in 2019? Exactly, COVID. Record numbers on the farms in the state of Louisiana, and COVID hits. Can't sell alligator skins again. So basically the same thing happens. And the graph kind of ends there. The Wildlife and Fisheries gave me this graph. It ends in 2020. So we did the same thing all over again in 2020. Send skins overseas. We've collected for most of them, but we still haven't collected for all. I wanted to also mention that, see the number at the bottom, in 2019, that same year, record egg collection of almost 651,000 eggs. Probably Vermilion Parish, to get back local here, maybe 120,000 of that was Vermilion Parish. Pretty significant. Any questions on that? Yes?
How do you think the current weather situation is going to affect you?
So, unprecedented, we don't know. We've had droughts before, but this is the longest lasting one. And I don't know what the month of August did to them. The record heat, they're very resilient, so, more than likely be okay. But the one thing that I'll say for certain, if we don't have a wet winter and a wet spring, it's going to be very similar to 2006 next year. Might be what we need, as an industry. I don't know. But good question. Let's briefly talk about the successes. I'm getting the wave back here. Okay. This is farm skins that have been harvested across the state of Louisiana since 1980. I did the math. 7.2 million skins. Since, again, let's keep in mind these next few slides. I call this, we're selling dead alligators. What I mean by that is we're selling the 95% mortality. That's what we're dealing with here, this whole program. We're taking advantage of that 95% that wouldn't make it in the wild. That's what's really significant about some of the successes here. Value. So every year, the state calls a few farms and asks how much we're getting for our skins, and they track the value of the skins that are sold from 1980 to 2019. I did that math. $1.2 billion. So with a B. So I spoke to the guy who gave me this chart, and we kind of laughed He said, you know that chart's not right. I said, yeah, I know that chart's not right. Because when they call and ask me, how much are you selling your skins for? About whatever, right? Shoot them kind of low. So that may be more like 1.5, 1.7 billion dollars. I don't know. With that 95%. Capital B, exactly. Well, okay, coast. This is kind of interesting. From 1970, every year the state flies the coast and does a survey of nest. And you can look at the trend. All of the trends with alligators and alligator farming is the success is evident in the charts. That these guys had the right idea when they came up with the idea of alligator farming. To answer your question about the current population or the peak, it's more than they can really accurately estimate, but it's between 2 and 3 million across the state of Louisiana now. So, and I can tell you that the focus now is to try to bring that down. There's probably a little bit more than the environment really needs. Eric?
Is it safe to say that farming saved the endangered species?
Now, I wouldn't say it saved it, but I would say that it accelerated the recovery. Because with the 10 years off and the controlled wild harvest, I think they were gonna save the species with the wild harvest. But this accelerated things. I mean, this basically, this recovery's been over 40 years. I can speak from a worldwide perspective. When you deal with any endangered species across the world, they all look to the Louisiana Alligator Program as the shining star. They modeled their programs across the world on what we did. None of this happens without this right here. Luxury goods. These folks, I'm not gonna mention the name of it. Well, I'll mention that. You got an LV bag, you got a Jean Rousseau watch strap, and you've got a Hermes Birkin bag. One of these bags sells for roughly $70,000. I'm not gonna say which one. But without this, none of what we talked about for the last 55 minutes happens. So, our motto is, buy a handbag, save an alligator. Right. Now look, you don't have to go buy the $70,000 one. You can buy a $100 bill, $200 bill. But when you utilize alligator leather, you're supporting this whole program. It doesn't happen without this. One thing I forgot to mention, we talked about the $1.whatever billion of sales. LSU did a study a couple years ago. It's somewhere between $250 and $270 million economic impact per year, alligator farming, in rural Louisiana. Pretty big deal here. So,
What about boots?
absolutely. Boots, buy boots. I think everybody needs a pair of alligator boots. You don't have to buy the $2,000 ones. You can go right there to Maurice and get some for a lot less. But everybody should have some.
So what do you do with the meat? You talk about selling the skins.
One second.
Just took my question.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, so the meat, no, so actually the meat is super, super high demand right now. More than we can produce. The meat is probably, on long-term average, the meat is maybe only 5% of the value. It might be closer to 10% now because skin prices are depressed and meat is not. But no, meat is there's a shortage of alligator meat in the United States.
So it said the meat is just sent throughout the United States?
Mostly. I mean, I'm sure there's some that get shipped overseas, but I mean, it's in such high demand here in the States. I can remember back in the 90s, we were looking to ship meat overseas because there was no domestic market. Well, it's crazy right now.
Is that for human consumption mainly?
Yeah, all for human consumption.
So what do you feed them now?
Oh, good question. So, I don't know, probably in the late 90s, around 2000, they developed a commercial feed, which looks like, it looks like a dog food pellet, or if anybody's ever fed floating catfish pellets, or it's basically what it is. But it's formulated for alligator. It's got it's got the right proteins, the right ingredients that help the alligator thrive. So we've completely replaced the nutrient in the fish. And if Eric doesn't mind me going a little bit longer, we used to feed whatever we could get. So nutria, but that was seasonal. Fish, not as good as nutria. So you're looking for red meat. We get, I don't know where it came from, don't get me wrong, but we'd buy horse meat. You get tractor trailer loads of horse meat. It was ground up horse. The nastiest stuff you ever could imagine. It smelled. Well, that was like the nutria replacer back in the late 90s. Everybody wanted it. Didn't happen to us, but, and Mark may remember, some farms started having trouble with their alligators getting kind of droopy, kind of going to sleep. So residuals from all the drugs, from racehorses, and from the euthanasia drugs was there was enough trace in the system that they were putting alligators to sleep. So that was the end of, and that's about the time they outlawed butchering horses at any time. Anyway, yes.
Where do they produce the feed that you're talking about now?
It's actually there's a mill in southeast Louisiana. Help me, Mark. Where's Cargill? Franklinton, Louisiana, and then there's one. Purina, that's Cargill. Purina, there's two companies that make feed. Purina may have one in southern Arkansas, or it's in Missouri, I forget. Missouri. It's in Missouri. Yeah. Yes.
Who processes the skin? I mean, you all,
So we'll process in the sense of we do the skinning, we sell the carcass meat, we salt the skins. We basically cure the skins where it's salted and refrigerated and ship it to a tanner who will actually do what you see here. Turn them into leather and dye them whatever
so you
color.
do it, y'all do the processing.
Yeah, we do our own processing.
And then the meat is, then what do you do?
So
with the same thing?
we deal with a company, it's called Rice and Crawfish out of Eunice. They take the whole carcass, they do the filet and the packing and take it from there.
How are they shipped?
The skins? The skins are shipped in wooden crates, about like 4 foot by 4 foot, about 3 foot tall. Anywhere from the smaller skins, about 800 in a crate, down to maybe 250 of the larger.
And the postal system or?
No, it's mostly by air. So we deliver to a warehouse at the airport in New Orleans. It's all shipped out of New Orleans. U.S. Fish and Wildlife inspects it there. There's the U.S. New Orleans is one of the ports that U.S. Fish has a special alligator person, because all of this is highly regulated by the state and by the federal government. So they look at every skin. It's got to have a unique tag. It's well documented throughout the whole process. Eric?
Take a couple more first.
Okay.
You had mentioned there's an optimal size. Beyond that, it's not worth growing it larger.
Okay, so optimal size depends on what the market wants. So for years, watch strap. That's what drove us through 2000 to about 2015. That's where you really saw that trend. Is watch strap market was incredible. We were produced by 300,000, 400,000 of the skins produced in the state of Louisiana went to that watch strap market. So that's only about a 3.5 foot animal, because you want the watch strap is small. You want a smaller pattern. If you get into handbags and wallets and belts and shoes, they want one that's more like 5 foot long. But I can tell you this, at the farm level, when you get past about 5 foot, you're dealing with a more dangerous animal. One of the challenges we have, Eric's gonna fuss, but go back to those first buildings I showed y'all with the shallow water. What we learned is you need deeper water. It's like goldfish in an aquarium. The same square footage, if you increase the water depth, you increase your capacity, but when they pile up in the corners, they swim over each other. They don't fight. So we had to, you can get away with growing the larger animals and still have good quality, but that stops at about 5 foot. Yes?
Stephen, how did you ever get them to stop biting?
With what I just, is that for me?
Yeah.
Is that it? It would be Mike who didn't turn his phone off. That deep water is probably the biggest key. But shed temperature, we kind of learn the optimal temperature, not to let them get too hot. The right amount of water. Whenever you flush the buildings, you don't want to leave them dry very long. You want to fill up really fast. You want this. We have the same guy who feeds every day. They recognize you. In other words, they don't like strangers. So the same guy goes in to wash, to feed every day. I don't go in and check on things. I used to. We used to give tours, you know. You think, you know, go in there, but they'd all pile up in the corners and bite each other. So those few things right there are kind of some of the things we learn how to keep the biting down. And speaking of tours, if anybody wants to put in their phone, the end of August is when the hatch takes place. We do tours for hatch. So anybody who would want to come, please reach out.
So do you know they sell the alligator heads in a lot of shops?
Mhm.
What is the regulation to be able to take that overseas as a gift? Do you know? Is there a special?
You know, I don't know anybody who takes those overseas, but parts have, that's called a part. A part has a different regulation than a skin. So it doesn't have to be tagged. I mean, the problem with taking it overseas is if somebody finds it in an airport, it's more likely to be somebody who has no idea and is going to freak out. What are you doing with an alligator head? And you're going to be inconvenienced. There's really no regulation prohibiting it. So when you pack it, make sure they can't find it until you get to your destination. That'd be my advice to you. Yes, sir.
Stephen, I read that the largest caught in the wild was on Marsh Island. It was a 19-footer. Do you know whether or not that's accurate?
I have seen that documented more than one place, so I would assume that is correct.
Did your family have anything to do with
No.
that particular harvest?
No. That was early in the 1900s, if I recall. I mean, I saw it doing some research for this, but I can't remember. But no, it wasn't my family. Eric?
Can you tell the story about you and your sweet wife, Miss Angela, shopping in Paris?
So I left that out because I knew you were going to ask. Before I do that, I've got one more question here.
I have a question. You know how they closed the hunting season
Mhm.
for 10 years, nobody could hunt alligator.
Mhm.
And you said when it reopened, there was regulation.
Oh, okay.
How many you could catch and whatever, but no poles. So after the poles, what did y'all hunt?
So what they came up with was the way most gators are harvested now is hanging a hook over the water. So the alligator actually swims, takes the bait, and gets hooked. Or you can
Like fishing.
it's like fishing. Or I mean, if you see them in a canal, you get a shot, you can shoot them. But the idea with that was that is in canals, in deep water. You're fishing in deep water, so you're targeting more males. So that was the idea. And another thing about the regulation, they set the season up for the month of September after all the nests have hatched. So if you've got a lot of times the mother hears those babies calling, they're buried in that nest. They can't get out. So the mother will open the nest in many cases and let them out. So the idea was let's wait till everything's hatched. That way if any females do get caught and they were nesting, chances are their babies may have a better chance to survive. But that was pole hunting was outlawed. It was just too unfair. I think mainly it was because you wound up harvesting more females. I don't know. I'd have to. The folks who made those decisions, I didn't get to talk to them about that, but it makes sense to me. Yes.
How old do you think that 19-foot alligator was?
This is recorded, right? No, I mean, if I had to guess, it was over 50 years old. And when I say over, I'm giving myself a lot of leeway. It could have been 70 years old. It could have been, but it was, it was old. Yes.
What country buys the most alligator hides that you know of?
It changes. So I had a graph that stated that, but it changes. Yeah, she asked what country buys the most alligator skins. And it changes from France, Italy, Singapore, kind of with the market and with, sometimes I don't know why it changes. But primarily France buys the most. They have the most tanneries. Italy comes in usually close second. They got the second most tanneries. And then Singapore is usually third. So they have the capacity. They have the folks that know how to do it. They have the manufacturing there in Europe. So that's who drives this thing, really. Well, so in the early days, there were brokers in New York they were traders. We would sell to a trader. And then when you get to around 2000, my dad, my mother, they started traveling the world meeting tanners and basically introducing ourselves to them. So we developed relationships direct with the tanners, bypassed the brokers. So, and then you got the internet comes along. So the world just keeps getting smaller. So now actually I have, semi-annually conference calls with the guys who make those watch straps and my tanner. Now I sell to the tanner who sells to the watch strap maker who sells to the watch company. But everybody's starting to communicate with everybody. So, it's really easy for them. Everybody knows everybody. We all know what everybody's doing. And it's really gotten really simple. The communication part's gotten really simple. Okay. So Eric wants to hear my story.
Any more questions before you tell?
I don't think this story's a big deal, but maybe I'll work my way back into my steak dinner. So, my wife and I and my youngest daughter were in Paris. I had meetings with the LVMH folks that own Louis Vuitton, and they came along with me. And after the meetings, we decided to go to the Louis Vuitton store in Paris. High fashion, right? Show you what I know about fashion. I made my hat match my shirt. That's it. So I was a little bit out of place. But so we go. You have to wait in line because they only allow so many people in there. They're worried about shoplifting or whatever. I don't know. So we wait in line about an hour. We finally get in. Ask, where are the alligator bags? And they look at us kind of funny. And they take us to the bag. And so this little lady comes up, salesperson, and I'd love to see your alligator bags. She said, oh, I'm sorry, sir, you need an appointment. We can't show unless you have an appointment. So I said, well, that's disappointing. I flew all the way from Louisiana because those are my skins. She said, excuse me, sir, give me just 1 second. She runs off. So we're waiting around. She comes back with a manager and some glasses and some champagne. And tell me about the alligator farm. So needless to say, we got to, my girls they're all starry-eyed and, just checking it all out. I'm looking at, you got to wear these white gloves to hold the bag. I'm looking at the bag for scars and bites. Because I'm like, you've been discounting me and I see a bite right there. You're telling me you can't use those. So that's what I was doing. But that's my Louis Vuitton store in Paris story.
So wasn't that story worth it?
Eric, I know we're over time, but there's one other point that I want to bring up. This entire program is heavily monitored by the state of Louisiana, but it has not cost the Louisiana taxpayer a dime. All of the early research was funded by the Rockefeller Trust Fund and oil revenues off of Rockefeller. And in 1991, we created a fund called Alligator Resource Fund, where we charge every skin that leaves the state of Louisiana, every skin or live animal, gets charged a fee that basically funds their entire oversight program and research through today. So all of this was, I'm not a big government guy, but government had a really good idea this time, worked with private enterprise, didn't cost anybody anything, and it was successful. So thanks, everyone. Thanks for your patience on this.
Just once again, thank y'all for coming. Our next program will be in January. Still working on that one. And before you leave, please sign our sign-in sheet in the back for an email address. We'd love to keep in touch with you. And thank you so much for coming. We sure appreciate it. Meeting is adjourned.
Okay, for those who don't want to leave, I didn't get to introduce you guys to the Sagrera team here. Might make my mother a little weepy-eyed. Okay, to the left is, I'll start with my dad in the middle. That's me to his right. My youngest brother, Raphael, all the way to the far right. Far left is Craig. Next one to my dad is Kevin. And the 4 sons each have a son who's in the business with us now. So that 5th generation.
You can tell where Steven's family's sitting because there's some really nice handbags up front.
Hey, Corey and Chad, before you go, here's a picture of Pete Leger collecting eggs. I got some photos that I'll just go through. These are kind of lanyard. Eric's not gonna like this, but if anybody wants to see them, not part of the presentation, but you guys are gonna like some of it. It's a photo of what an alligator nest looks like in the wild from the air. A few photos of mothers protecting their nest. Okay, Charlene, to answer your question, what's going on right here is, this is my brother Craig. He's marking the orientation of the egg. He's marking the top of the egg so that as we move it around, we don't change the orientation. Because the embryo attaches to the top of the egg, and it gets its oxygen through the eggshell. So if you turn that egg over, basically the embryo will drown. It's not like a chicken or duck egg you got to roll over. So that's what's going on here. He's marking every egg as he picks it up so that when it gets transferred to the basket in the boat and then to the incubator, to the incubation room, that orientation stays the same. Where's Chad? Is he still here? You recognize that guy? Chad Leger. Rocking the, what do they call that? A wife beater shirt? Yeah, here's another example of them setting the eggs, with the mark and keeping that orientation, right? Oh, yeah, now we get to the cute.
Look at the cute alligator.
There's just a few photos of some alligators that are hatching on the farm. I forgot to mention that back in the 80s, we sponsored a softball team. We were called the Vermilion Gator Farm Skinners. We won 2 or 3 games, never won a tournament, but we would win the beer drinking championship every weekend. Yes.
Years ago, I think it was in the early 90s, your dad, I worked for the advertising, and I did a story on it. And I'm wondering, do you still have the baskets, the straw, and the eggs, and then the straw on top? Because I got to witness it. He opened that basket, the top of it, and when he took like the wet straw from it, all of a sudden, you get pep, 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 and then egg. Then the head would drop up. It was like popping.
It's mimicking, so you can hear them make, that's how we know when a nest is ready to hatch. We listen. We tap on and listen. If they start calling, if you open that grass, they're gonna come out. Same thing happens in the wild.
Wow. It was very cool. It was
Yeah.
50 years ago. So y'all still do it that way with the baskets in the hay?
Yes. Well, no, yes and no. We actually use sphagnum peat moss now as our medium, because the marsh grass, there's so many different marsh grasses out there. Some has a little more dirt in it. If it's on a levee, it's got more dirt, So we were having a variation in temperature in the same incubator. So we started using sphagnum moss. We'd wet it, get the moisture that we want, and we were consistent throughout the building.
Where do you get this sphagnum moss?
Thibodeau's Feed Store in Abbeville gets it for us. It comes, I believe it's actually, most of that's harvested in Canada. I believe is where it actually originates from. But yeah, the local feed store gets it for us. All right. Remember, buy a bag. Save an alligator. Hey, we've got, before you guys leave, feel free to come check out. We've got some items up here for you to check out.
One more round of applause. Steven Sagrera.